President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to say how much I have come to admire in a short period of time the junior senator from New Jersey. That was a real speech. You know, we're obviously spending 30 hours on the floor to oppose Russ Vought's nomination, and you know, a lot of people have to come here and speak for 60 minutes or 30 minutes or 90 minutes, and we'll take anything, right? You know, some people just read whatever they've got, and we appreciate all of it because we have to take the floor and we have to maintain presence on this floor. But that was a beautiful, well-crafted speech about American democracy, about his life story, about his dedication to public service, and so I'm very honored to work alongside him. Last week, without any advance notice, OMB issued a memo freezing all federal funding in order to end, quote, wokeness, Marxist equity, transgenderism, and a Green New Deal social engineering policies. Like, I just want to, we can pause right here, right? This is not the kind of thing that the OMB is supposed to say, right? It's the Office of Management and Budget. They're not supposed to have an opinion about wokeness or not wokeness or anything like that. It's just it's a very odd way to view what is otherwise a kind of technocratic position. And that's what's very important about this particular OMB and this particular OMB director. He does not view it as merely administering the budgets and the spending bills within the government. He views it as a power center through which all of his ideology and all of Project 2025 is going to be implemented. Like, to think of the Office of Management and Budget as a place to fight wokeness and Marxist equity, I don't even know what any of that means, but I think a lot of us know the previous OMB director. She was really well regarded by both sides of the aisle. I think the presiding officer actually knew her from Louisiana. And, you know, like, she was left of center, but she would never say anything other than what is sort of straight down the middle as it relates to the Office of Management and Budget. And that's why would we take the floor for the OMB director? Well, it's because he's the author of Project 2025. He's essentially the architect behind the federal funds freeze. And in Project 2025, among all the things that they talk about, they also devote a huge passage to how important OMB is and how powerful the next OMB director should be. Just so happens that the author of that section saying the OMB director should be pretty close to all powerful and essentially representing the president in all things, policy and budget. So happens that the guy that wrote that passage is the guy that's going to be in the job to do that. So, I mean, that seems kind of neat. I think OMB should be all powerful. Also, I think I should run OMB. So that's what we're talking about. But just understand what happened last week was not some attack on wokeness, whatever the hell that actually means. It was an attack on all of us. It really was an attack on all of us. All federal funding was suspended. Millions of Americans around the country were in the dark how they would access basic things: healthcare, education, childcare, small business loans, VA loans, disaster relief, opioid treatment, everything from road repairs to cancer research were shut down across the country. And you have to ask, aside from the very obvious fact that withholding funding from Congress that has already appropriated funding is plainly illegal, you have to ask, what on earth does so-called wokeness have to do with repairing a road? Or letting people fill their prescriptions at a community center? Or helping survivors of a flood or a wildfire to try to rebuild their lives? Is a child having a healthy meal wokeness? Is that DEI? Is that, I don't know, gender ideology? Or is that the Green New Deal? Like, seriously, what the hell are we doing here? A president is allowed to make policy. A president is expected to make policy. But they can't take a law and repeal it by executive order. And especially as it relates to a spending law, those laws are not actually optional, right? And there's a very simple way for a president to get his way in the spending context. They can influence. Listen, the Republicans control both chambers of the Congress, the House and the Senate, and the presidency. They had a big victory. I didn't love it, but they had a big victory. So if they want changes in spending policy, they can just do it the American way. And so this is like a combination of laziness, impatience, a not inconsiderable splash of illegality. But, I mean, this is amateur hour. You want to change something, you want to fight wokeness, whatever, again, whatever the hell that actually means. If we gotten to the point where shutting down a construction project is like attacking wokeness, then the actual word has ceased to mean anything. And DEI is this other like epithet that they throw at things, but the dragnet has caught all of Indian country, most native people everywhere. And you know what they did? They literally Control F, searched for keywords, and then pulled those things out. If they don't know anything about these programs, they pulled these things out if it said gender in it, or if it said equity, or if it said inclusive, or if it said climate. And they just like pulled it out and said, we're not funding that. First of all, what a goofy way to make policy. Seriously, what a goofy, like childish way to make policy. Second of all, just to reiterate, you don't get to do that. If you want to make a change in a law, you have to make a change in a law. You can't just write a memo saying, I don't like the law, therefore it no longer exists because I won. It is true that the president won. Free and fair election. Absolutely a free and fair election. I didn't like the result, but I was absolutely prepared to tolerate policy outcomes that I didn't like. But this is not that. This is then like skipping a step. And by skipping a step, I mean literally skipping the legislative branch. And so there's been a lot of consternation on the Republican side. I mean, a lot of consternation. Right-wing Republicans, moderate Republicans, all of them are a little like, I don't know about this. But you can't stand up for the legislative branch in secret. You can't uphold the Constitution privately. At some point, you have to stand up for your prerogatives. And I mean, listen, there's a lot of very talented people here, actually. I don't agree with them. Some of them I don't even like. But super talented people, high-achieving human beings who could be doing something else. And my view is, like, if you're going to forfeit your constitutional prerogatives, like, go be I don't know, whatever. Do something else. Do something more interesting. Do something more lucrative. Do something more easy. But if you're going to be here, and you're going to go through all the pain of running for election, of getting beat up by everybody left, right, and center, of people complaining about you, of putting your family through challenges. I'm serious. Why would you do that and then forfeit, like, I'd say 2/3 of the power that you're in possession of? You ran presumably to achieve some measure of influence so you could actually change things. And now there's just a collective shrug of the shoulders. So the problem with Mr. Vought is twofold. One, we have a government with 3 co-equal branches, and Congress, as the Article I branch, holds the power of the purse. And we decide what to fund and at what levels. And in the face of an illegal action, the courts can step in and strike it down, as several judges did with the original funding freeze memo. And this is one of the things, to the extent that there are at least 20 or 30 people still watching. Donald Trump and his team are running a huge bluff. It's not that they're not causing damage. I know they're causing damage. But understand that what they want to do is multiple illegal things and then see if they can get a few of these things to stick. They have articulated that pretty clearly. Mr. Vought has said that. J.D. Vance has said a version of that, and just say, we're going to defy the federal law and see whether we can come up with some judges who will give us a different interpretation. And so the reason that that's an important thing to say is not just for me to be another Democrat saying, I can't believe he did this, but to understand Donald Trump is not the only person in the world who's not constrained by federal law. We saw last week the federal funding freeze was found to be illegal, and it was suspended, and there's an injunction against it. Last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, the birthright citizenship nonsense was rejected by a federal judge. Even what's happening with the access to the Treasury payments is being constrained in the court system. So I'm not like Pollyanna about the status of the court system. I'm very frustrated, especially with the Supreme Court, and I do not expect, if it's at all a close call, for it to break our way. But these are not close calls. These are clear violations of federal statutory law. And so we don't want to give up in advance. The roots of democracy are still strong. And like my old, now friend, one-time adversary, the former Speaker of the House in the state of Hawaii, Calvin Say, he used to say, be like the bamboo. Bend but don't break. And so we all have to understand that Donald Trump is a disruptor, and it's going to be rocky. But this idea that he's just going to rack up wins and there's nothing anybody can do about it is a dangerous premise, because it can become self-fulfilling. People out on the streets, people in the courts, people in the legislature. We are out of power, but we are not powerless. And so everybody needs to understand that Russ Vought represents a very specific view of presidential power, which is essentially unitary executive, whatever you want to call it. But it's this view that once you win, you're basically a monarch. And that all those niceties, rules, I mean literally rules, right? You make a law, and then usually the agency has to make rules to kind of explain specifically how to implement any law. And they view that as just an impediment to the inherent constitutional power of one man. And this is also consistent with the way that the tech bros view government, right? They view government as like unnecessarily slow, right? Too many checks and balances. Why doesn't the government run like a business, right? And let me tell you why. Because if you ran government like a business, you would shut down every rural hospital. If you ran government like a business, you would actually not have a national transportation network. You wouldn't have a library in Keau. If you ran government like a business, by the way, most of the money would be spent in the cities. And so we have a system of government that we all have to be committed to defending. I want to spend a little bit of time with some letters that I received from constituents last week. And I just wasn't expecting it all to go sideways so quickly. After the OMB memo came out that said federal agencies must temporarily pause all activities related to the obligation and disbursement of all federal financial assistance. What a crazy, can you imagine being a person who previously was at OMB? This person is not, new to this. Issuing a memo saying, pause all activities related to obligation or disbursement of funds. I knew immediately, I was oh my God. There's these portals, right? Then they're basically websites. And if you're the Department of Hawaiian Homelands or the Hawaii Department of Transportation, almost daily, you're doing draws. You have your little code words, you send your little invoice, and then there's an electronic transfer of money to a clinic or a construction project or the Veterans Administration or whatever it is. And those portals were shut down and everybody was in an actual panic. And I'm not exaggerating. People voted for Trump for all sorts of reasons, but one of the reasons that kept coming up over and over was they thought he would bring down the price of eggs, the price of groceries, the price at the pump. What they did not vote for was their ability to lose their ability to get a home loan or health care or child care or a healthy meal or a good education for their children. I want to read a couple of letters from constituents. I'm reaching out with a heavy heart as a program planner and student advisor who works directly with students across several Maui County schools. I also want to include representation of our sister programs, which collectively provide vital support for low-income, first-generation, and Native Hawaiian students. This year has been one of the most difficult in recent memory for our students and their families. The devastating Lahaina wildfires have left deep scars in our community, and many of our students are still working to recover from the emotional, physical, and financial toll that disaster caused. For many of them, this catastrophe was a breaking point where they saw their homes, their schools, and even their sense of safety and stability go up in flames. Despite overwhelming loss, these students are still resilient. They are fighting to stay afloat, to keep their dreams alive, and to continue their education, despite the trauma that they've endured. These support programs have been there for them every step of the way, offering them emotional support, academic assistance, and a safe space for students to process their grief and focus on the future. Through our programs, they have found a sense of community and hope. Our academic advisors and mentors have been working tirelessly to ensure that even in the wake of the fires, these students know that they are not alone, that there is a path forward. But now we face a crisis that could further jeopardize these opportunities for these young people. OMB has imposed a federal freeze on funds set to take effect at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. This freeze will halt the disbursement of federal funds, including those essential for our programs. Without access to these funds, we will be unable to continue providing services that our students need to heal, thrive, and succeed. The support that they so desperately need, academic tutoring, mentorship, college prep, and a strong network of peer support will be in jeopardy. For many of our students, this isn't just a program, it is a lifeline. These students are not just looking for a way to finish high school, they are looking for a chance to rebuild their lives, to break the cycles of poverty and hardship, and to find their footing in a world that has been turned upside down. To take away the programs that have supported them through the wildfires, and their ongoing recovery would be devastating. Is this program woke? Is it DEI? Is it Marxist? What the hell are we doing here? What the hell are we doing here? Why would we cause this amount of pain? Some sense of fiscal discipline? We're not saving the money. On top of everything else, thousands and thousands and thousands of employees, not just at USAID, but at the Small Business Administration, at the CIA, were sent home. And by the way, because of civil service law, we can't lay them off. It's not a private sector situation. You can't lay them off as a matter of law. So we sent them home to not work. We're shutting people out of their emails to not deliver service to the public. Awesome. Let's run the government like the worst business ever, where we're just going to pay people not to work. I'm an 8th grade student at Halau Kumana in Honolulu, Hawaii. I am writing to ask for your support in protecting federal funding for Native Hawaiian education. The proposed freeze on federal financial assistance under Executive Memo M2513 puts programs like ours at risk. Without them, students like me will lose access to the cultural education that connects us to our identity. At Halau Kumana, our learning is different from other schools. We don't just sit in the classroom all day. We malama our aina, meaning care for the land. We learn from cultural experts and study through real experiences. Programs funded by federal grants allow us to go on educational journeys, restore fish ponds, grow food in lo'ikalo taro patches, and learn traditional skills. These experiences teach us about our past and prepare us for the future. I guess it was too woke. As your constituent, I'm writing to express strong opposition to the White House order to freeze federal funding across all federal agencies. Millions of families will lose access to services provided by SNAP, TANF, and HUD housing assistance. Millions of students in Head Start, grade schools, and colleges will lose access to classroom funding, school resources, federal loans, and Pell Grants. Millions of local firefighters and public safety officials would lose federal grants and resources needed to protect communities. Millions of veterans would lose access to VA mortgages and home loans and suicide prevention services. Is that woke Marxist ideology? See, what's happening is they want to dismantle the public services that we all rely upon. Can you imagine a week ago, a little more, I guess it was a little more than a week ago, air traffic controllers were told to quit. And we got I think it's a 30% vacancy rate. We are short of air traffic controllers. And this is not look, I understand, I've been in politics, I've been an appropriator for a while. Sometimes people cry wolf. If you don't give us this money, it's going to be dire. But the air traffic controller situation is quite dire. And we saw the impact of being understaffed last week. And so the language about woke and Marxism and all that stuff is a smokescreen. What they truly want to do is dismantle whatever the federal government does. If it's firefighting, if it's the CIA, if it's the National Weather Service, if it's VA home loans, their Project 2025, is they call it dismantle the administrative state, but really what they want to do is provide less service to people. And the reason that they want to do that is they got a yawning $1 to $1.5 trillion gap that they have to fill because they want to provide a $1 to $2 trillion tax cut for the wealthiest corporations that have ever existed, literally have ever existed. And they've got a bunch of kind of hardcore fiscal conservatives on the House side that just won't do it on a deficit finance basis, so they have to find savings, and that's what this is. They really are cutting the stuff that matters to regular people, and then they're going to book that as savings, and then they're going to shove it in the direction of billionaires and billionaire corporations. I see my friend Senator Murphy is here, and, you know, it's a little bit like old times to see you on the floor at 2 a.m., and it used to be easier when I was on Hawaii time, but I've been here for a couple of weeks, so this is actually late for me. And I just want to recognize that, you know, we've got most Democratic senators speaking at some point through this 30-hour period, but Murph decided to take the 2 to 5 a.m. shift, so I hope you haven't had too much Mountain Dew at this point, but I'd be happy to yield to the senator from Connecticut, and with the permission of the chair, I ask unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy without having to go through the chair every time.
Without objection.
Just for the record, Senator Schatz is Diet Mountain Dew. Mountain Dew is disgusting. Diet Mountain Dew is acceptable.
Can I just say one thing about I did not know that this whole Senate is powered on Celsius. I've never had Celsius before, but I was walking around offering people coffee, and everyone had a Celsius.
Yeah, I think it's like 2 or 3 times the amount of caffeine that a Red Bull has. So there's a reason why the conversion is happening. Not that I have an intimate understanding of which beverages have which amounts of caffeine. But I am motivated to get up at this point because I think you hit on something really, really important. There are a number of different lanes that the policy we're talking about and the agenda of Russ Vought occupies. But I thought you just talked about a really important one, which is the effort to take anything left in the common space and shift it off to the private sector to become a commodity, right? So much of what we are discussing today is an effort to raid services that help poor people and kids and middle-class families and just bank that money so that they can afford this giant tax cut that's going to go primarily to the very, very wealthy and the corporations because Mr. Vought and the other folks who wrote Project 2025 and the other people that are populating this administration still believe in this long discredited theory of trickle-down economics in which if you just give a ton of money to the very, very richest, then eventually that money will trickle its way down to everybody else. That's not how economics work. It was a fraud from the beginning. It's just intellectual window dressing for the rich and the powerful to get more rich and powerful. But there's this other lane that you're talking about, which is finding the last remaining elements of public services that we decide to do together, not for profit, and turn it into a source of profit. TSA is one of those targets. So Project 2025, written in part by Russ Vought, says TSA, this is the Transportation Security Administration, this is the agency responsible for the security at our airports, should just be outsourced to the private sector, that some private equity firm should be running security at our airports. To a lot of Americans, that idea is frightening. The idea that we would just turn security at the airports over to an entity that is doing it only for profit. It seems like we should have a public mission at the heart of airport protection. But you are reading this letter from, it sounded like a student, who may not see what's coming for our school system. This is, I was going to talk about this later, but I'll bring it up now. And without objection, I'll enter this article called Back to School, Investors Are Bullish Again on Education into the record.
Without objection.
This is a pretty long article on a massive play being made by private equity into education, and in particular into elementary education. It's kind of hard to think about this, but it may be coming. And that is a private equity firm or a hedge fund or an investment firm owning your child's elementary school. Right now, private equity investors are lining up to put money in funds because they believe they are going to have a chance to bid on your child's elementary school, to bid on your child's middle school, that we are literally going to outsource the education of our kids to investment firms. And if you read this article, it is absolutely chilling because the folks that cover the private equity industry, they're kind of, used to being unapologetic about the fact that the only thing that matters is money, right? So if you read this article, there's not a single word in here about quality or about making sure that, there aren't 50 kids in a classroom. It is just about the private equity industry realizing that, oh my gosh, there is a ton of money that we can pull out of our elementary schools and our middle schools. This is a wonderful source of profit for us. They're not mission-oriented, they are profit-oriented. And so, in addition to this agenda about stripping bare services in order to create the illusion that you're saving money so that you can pass along a tax cut to the very wealthy, this is also just a simple play to take every element of public services that haven't been commoditized and turn them into a commodity so that somebody can get rich. And I don't know. I get sick at the idea of my kid's middle school becoming a source of profit. I'm a capitalist. I believe this country is great because we allow people to get fabulously rich off of entrepreneurship and great ideas. But man, I just think there should be like a couple things that we don't do for profit. I just think there should be a few things that we do because it's just the right thing to do. Whether it's police protection or fire protection or building a road or educating our kids or protecting our airports, like not everything has to be for profit. And so I just wanted to pick up on this really important element of the 2025 plan and the Trump administration's agenda.
Well, let me I just want to drill down on why the profit motive is so dangerous to public service. If you're in the business of trying to figure out where to drop a Starbucks or whatever, you got to figure out where the people are, right? And you would not drop a Starbucks in a place where it's a 300-person town. Fair enough. You don't have to drop a Starbucks there. But you do need a health clinic somewhere around there. And you do need a public library somewhere around there. And you're going to want a fire station somewhere around there. And if everything becomes a question of profitability and arithmetic and ROI, what's going to happen is that rural communities are not going to get what they need. Because if you do that arithmetic as if you were a private sector investor, I promise you the only place anything makes any sense to do it is in the cities. And that's what they're going to do. They're going to eviscerate public service across rural America. I think the senator from Connecticut knows this. I care very much about NOAA and the National Weather Service. And part of Project 2025 is this idea that we should privatize NOAA. Like, these people launch satellites, provide us with data, and then people can make, basic plans, what they're going to do that day, but aviation depends on it, farming depends on it, shipping depends on it. And the backbone of this is like a pretty expensive data collection enterprise and satellite launching and maintenance enterprise. And in the back of that, right, like there's AccuWeather and these private sector companies, and they'll put a skin on it and give you an app that tells you what the weather is, but they're all using the NOAA data. They're using the National Weather Service data. What they want is to be able to monetize this public service, and it is always that. It's socializing the losses and privatizing the gains. And I think that's what these folks want to do. But they've always kind of wanted to do this. They've always had this point of view. And some of our Republican colleagues have a point of view where at the edges we could have an argument about what ought to be a private sector enterprise or what ought to be a public-private partnership. Like, those are all kind of within the bounds of normal political discussion. But that's not what this is. This is like arson.
Yeah, and to your point, when profit is the only motive, somebody loses out. Your example about, a health clinic in a rural area is true also of education, right? I mean, it's pretty costly. It is not monetizable to have a school in a very rural area where teachers have to drive long distances, where there, isn't a high volume of kids. And so if you live in a world in which the private sector gets to run our schools, then you're just going to have haves and have-nots. You might have in-person education in the cities or in the suburbs, but those private equity firms will figure out pretty fast that it just doesn't make a lot of sense to run a bricks and mortar school in a rural area, and those kids will just be constantly telelearning. Those kids will just be staring at their screens all day long.
If there's any internet.
If there's any internet. And so, there are places when it comes to government and government services where there's a proper role for the private sector. We have long had public-private partnerships inside the Department of Defense. I think we have very well married together a fundamental public mission, right? We don't privatize the Army, right, with a private sector mission. The technology for the Army gets developed a little bit faster if the private sector has a role to play. But what we have realized is that there are limits to the degree to which the private sector wants to own unprofitable services. One of the grants that got turned off before the court injunction was issued was grants to community health centers. And community health centers, which are not-for-profit healthcare centers that are primarily funded by the federal government, often exist in the places where there is not a profit motivation to run healthcare, either in rural areas or in very low-income areas of cities. They run on very, very thin very thin margins at all. They don't make profit. Very thin margins. And so when they miss one payment from the federal government, they are talking about immediately laying off workers.
I used to run a social service agency. We had a couple hundred employees. We delivered mental health services, and we were a Medicaid provider. And it was back in the day when we weren't yet receiving electronic payments. And I would I would wait for the mail every Wednesday and Thursday to see if we had to dip into our line of credit to make payroll. And we ran a successful agency, and we were one of the bigger social service agencies on the island of Oahu, the most populous island in Hawaii. But that's what this is like. Even if you're a pretty solid social service agency or health clinic, it's always hand to mouth. You don't have some cash reserves. And so when they turned off that spigot, it was instantaneous, right? And I think part of what's happening with 2025, and excuse me for maybe diverting our conversation slightly, is that there's just a lot of very ideological people in cubicles that haven't been outside of Washington, D.C., and are actually thinking in abstractions, and they truly believe in their heart of hearts. It's the billionaires, first of all, but it's also some other people who wrote the document who believe, deeply, that no one's going to miss the federal government if it doesn't deliver these services. And I think one of the things that has given me some comfort in the last couple of weeks, and, it's been a rough couple of weeks, is that, boy, it was instantaneous, right? People were freaked out across the country, red states, blue states, rural, urban, suburban, exurban, everyone was like, what the hell, right? I might have voted for Donald Trump, I might not have, but nobody wants this. You're at the helm of the federal government. You're at the helm of the federal government, and then you just, within the first 2 weeks go, I'm going to destroy this place. Isn't that what you wanted? No, people didn't vote for Donald Trump so he could destroy the federal government. They like that he's a disruptor. They like that he, doesn't talk like the rest of us. They were pissed about the cost of eggs and groceries and gasoline and all the rest of it. I understand all that. But I don't think this is what people signed up for. Like, I would like this guy to shut down the Medicaid portal. I would like for Head Start to have difficulty making payroll. I would like for construction projects to be staged and then send everybody home because there's no money to pay them. Like, this is not the kind of disruption that people thought they were getting. They thought it was going to be like, I'm going to make those Democrats uncomfortable, or I need a businessman to like not, to quote unquote think outside of the box. But this is not that. This is arson, and people saw it for what it is. And it wasn't one of those things where we're arguing about the impacts, and then 3 years from now, everybody figures out what the impacts were. It was instantaneous, and it was pretty violent, right? I don't mean physically violent, but I do mean like, whoa, what are you doing to us? Across society, right? And all under this like Marxist ideology, woke DEI, like it's just like you put a bunch of like please say cliche stuff about Democrats into ChatGPT and it like spit out an executive order.
And listen, we, if not for lawyers who brought lawsuits, if not for judges that issued injunctions, we would be in a different kind of crisis today. So we are talking about public outrage at an executive action that was midwifed in part by the nominee, that only existed for about a day before it was enjoined, before it was stayed. But if that executive order had actually been fully implemented, there literally would be today rural health clinics that would be shut down. There would be hundreds of thousands of children who would not be in preschool tomorrow morning. There would be a national catastrophe because whether or not these billionaires who don't need many government services unless their house catches on fire, even though they don't understand that people actually rely on government-funded services sometimes, this would have been an absolute nightmare and disaster. So we need to remember that, well, we feel like we are in a constitutional crisis right now. That crisis would be fundamentally different if not for the courts stepping in at this moment. And let me, just raise another issue with you, because I think you started by talking about the assumptions that, the young men in these cubicles made when they were writing Project 2025, when they're implementing these orders. I mean, there is this wild assumption about people who do public jobs, right? The contempt that this administration and these billionaires and the authors of Project 2025 have for public employees is just extraordinary. And who are public employees? Okay, you can, envision somebody sitting in a cubicle at a desk in Washington, D.C. pushing papers. That's a public employee, but so are teachers, and so are police officers, and so are firefighters. Here's what Russ Vought said about the federal workforce. He said, when they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want to put them in trauma. Like, he's talking about researchers at NIH that are trying to cure cancer. He's talking about, people who are trying to just get special education funds to our schools to make sure that our kids get a fair shot at learning. He's talking about the people at NOAA that are, just showing up to work every day, trying to make sure that we're prepared for natural disasters. The contempt that they have for people that get up every day and don't go work for a bank or a hedge fund or a private equity company, but instead go to work because they just want to make the world better, or their community better, or their country better, is absolutely extraordinary. It's if these folks have never actually spent any time with a teacher or a firefighter or an NIH researcher.
I think about my constituents in the IFPTE who work at the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, right? Like about 20 years ago, I guess, the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard was low performing. Like, it was not great. And there was the BRAC commission to determine, if we were going to get rid of some of these bases and installations. And quite reasonably, people were looking at Pearl Harbor as one of those to possibly get rid of it because it was so low performing. They have, in the great tradition, by the way, of after Pearl Harbor was bombed, and they quickly built a fuel storage facility and rebuilt ships in like months when they were expected that it would take a couple of years. What they did was literally like miraculous and caused us to win the war. Without it, we wouldn't have won the war. And those guys dug in, understood that there was a need for improvement, and now it's the best performing naval shipyard. Are they woke? Are they DEI? Like, what are we doing here? And I really just, I want every American to share our sense of outrage on behalf of the nurses and the firefighters and the technical workers and the welders and the boilermakers and the TSA agents and the Coast Guardsmen and women. These are patriots, right? And by the way, someone also in a cubicle pushing paper, that paper probably matters. It might be your VA benefits. It might be your Social Security benefits. It might be your ACA subsidy. And so, nobody likes a big bureaucracy. I'm a Kaiser member, and God bless everybody who works there, but I have my frustrations, getting through to someone, navigating the system. And so it's easy to hate anything that's big, whether it's, Verizon or Comcast or Kaiser or the federal government. You don't have to love everything that happens in any big organization, and you don't have to think it's perfect. It's not perfect. Federal government needs reform. I actually think there's some really interesting opportunities to provide better service using AI. I'm all in if you want to make the government work better. But DOGE is kind of dressing up what they're doing as some sort of effort at efficiency and a better delivery of service. That's actually not what they're doing. You don't terrorize your employees. Anybody who's run an organization larger than 2 people knows that if you're going to get stuff out of someone, then you can be tough, but you can't actually terrorize them.
We want to put them in trauma. What CEO says that about their workers?
They'd get, I was about to swear. It's the Senate floor. I will not. But they'd get canned. They'd get immediately sacked.
Their board of directors would get rid of them.
This guy's nuts. Get rid of him. Yeah. Right. Even in the private sector, just so we're clear, because there are also differences between the public and the private sector in terms of civil service protections and unions and all that, and I'm happy for that. Because, by the way, the unions are some of the people that are standing up not just for the rights of the workers, but the services they provide. And I think this is a little bit of a, look, I know not everybody's paying super close attention to all aspects of this. But I think in the abstract, people might have gone yeah, maybe you should cut the federal workforce by X, and there's probably a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. And conceptually thinking, yeah, who cares? And then suddenly you realize, oh, no, that's a VA home loan. Oh, I actually don't want a shortage of air traffic controllers. No, I don't want a private company collecting my biometric data as I go through the airport, right? And so there's kind of a broad recognition, there's a waking up to the idea that destroying the federal government is doing damage to the United States of America. It's not doing damage to woke something. It's not doing damage to the left. It's just the federal government has an important role in society, whether you like it or not. And we can argue about the size and the scope of that federal government, but that's not what we're arguing about anymore. They're out to destroy it. They don't want to make it 4% smaller over a period of time or 20%. They want to commit arson. They came in, I just want to talk about USAID. And I understand USAID is not an animating issue for most voters. Fair enough. You've got your own problems, and imagining money going elsewhere is sometimes hard to swallow. But I want to set that aside, whatever your view is of foreign aid, which you and I both strongly support because instability elsewhere is dangerous to the United States of America. But set all of that aside. They literally just shut everybody out of their email, told them all to go home. Like, we were standing there trying to enter USAID to just conduct some oversight and say what's happening, and we were told by the security guard that no one's there. No one was there. So this isn't like some efficiency effort. They're sacking everyone. And now I think it's 1,400, it might be more. Foreign service officers across the planet got an email. They're everywhere. They're at the embassies in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in Central America, everywhere. And they just got an email saying, come home. You have 30 days. If you want an exception for any health reason or any specific circumstances, you can submit to us. But otherwise, you're out. These people have their kids in school. These people are there to respond to disasters. These people are there to build relationships on behalf of the United States of America. Like, imagine the kind of person who takes the Foreign Service exam and then says, I want to work in Ghana. I want to work in Ecuador on behalf of this country. Like, those are legit patriots. And they get deployed wherever they get deployed, or sent, I shouldn't say deployed. They get sent wherever they get sent, and they try to dig in, and their kids go into the American school in whatever city it is, and it's challenging, but it's exciting, and it's important, and then they just get an email saying, we're recalling you, and there's no choice. That's not an efficient way to do anything. That's just arson.
Well, and they dressed that up for like 2 days, suggesting that they were reviewing USAID for efficiencies. For 1 day, they said they were folding it into the State Department because it would be more efficiently run inside the State Department. That was never the plan, right? I mean, we just sort of have to call out the fabrication, right? The plan clearly from the start was to eliminate USAID, and they willfully pretended for a handful of days that the agenda was efficiency, when the agenda was, in fact, the wholesale elimination of the agency. And the stated on-the-record reason for the elimination of the agency is bananas. Bananas. They are calling USAID a, quote, criminal organization. I mean, it's extraordinary. I was on a radio program the other day, and the interviewer wanted to talk to me about the constitutional crisis and whether legally the president can dismantle USAID. The answer is no, he cannot. But the interviewer was like, they say it's a criminal organization. Let's just set that aside for a minute. And I was like, no, wait a second. Like, don't let them get away with the idea that USAID has to be shuttered because it's a criminal organization. Apparently, the conclusion that they have come to, the allegation that they are making, is that because many of the USAID employees on their free time may support Democratic candidates for office, that it is a criminal enterprise because you are apparently not allowed to have any political views. There are certainly many other agencies and departments and public functions in which the majority of employees support Republicans. So public services are staffed by people who have a variety of views. But the rationale on its face for getting rid of the agency is just absolutely
too many Democrats.
Is absolutely absurd that it's too many Democrats. And so I guess we're going to shut down any agencies that have 50% plus one Democratic affiliation. We're going to hold on to agencies in which the employees are 50% plus one Republican. It shouldn't matter. I don't care whether a Republican or a Democrat is teaching my kid. I don't care whether a Republican or a Democrat is staffing the domestic violence shelter or putting out the fire at my neighbor's home. And most Americans don't care, but this war that has been waged, I mean, that's what woke means, right? Woke really just means that a service is being provided by somebody who's got views or a lifestyle that I don't agree with. And we have never approached public service like that. We have decided as a country that we're going to have these things, these people called civil servants that get up every day to serve the country, no matter what their background is, their ethnicity, their race, or their political views, or their religion, right? That their reason for getting up in the morning and going to work is to just serve everybody, to serve everybody. And we are now retreating to this world in which, no, the only legitimate people to work for the federal government are people who share the political views of the president, right? Because the purge is happening so many different ways.
Well, I just want to just sort of pause on that because, Chris, you're right. This is a purge. And I was sort of yelling in the press gallery, maybe not the best idea, but it was at a press conference. And I just basically pointed at all these people, whom I have a lot of respect for in the media. But I'm getting quite frustrated because this is actually not that hard to see if this were happening somewhere else, right? Like, we're both on the Foreign Relations Committee. We do a lot of travel. And a lot of times you sit down with some foreign leader, a minister, or the prime minister, or another legislator from another country. And if you can see, like, autocratic behavior like that, then it's literally on your talking points to encourage them to, not engage in purges, to maintain a free media, to the importance of an independent judiciary, blah, blah, blah. But when it happens to our own country, we just can't see it, right? If this were happening in Belarus, we would be like, creeping autocracy, right? If this were happening in a Middle Eastern country, we would know what this was. And so I think you're really hitting the right point as it relates to public service. And I think about the United States military, which has been always a bastion for integration, right? And for
all sorts of integration.
Right? And now we're deciding some people are not eligible to serve, not because they can't meet the requirements, but because somebody finds it weird. Like, we're going back not 5 years, but 20 or 30 in terms of, and by the way, this anti-DEI and anti-woke thing, I just want to drill down on it just for a moment. If what you don't like about DEI is like the whole consultancy where someone comes into your workplace with a PowerPoint or whatever and makes you feel guilty for your personal ethnic background, I've been in some of those meetings, and there's a lot of eye rolling, and they are very ineffective, and they do not increase diversity, equity, or inclusion. I'm sure there's good versions of it. But there's a lot of people who got frustrated with DEI because when they think of DEI, they think of a kind of goofy consultant guy telling everybody how to divide everybody in the workplace and how to be sensitive in the workplace. And a lot of people are thinking, I'm fine. I'm nice to people. I don't harass anyone. I don't discriminate. Why are you hectoring me about this issue? But what DEI has become is anything that's related to civil rights, right? And so as these people, mostly kids, are getting access to the federal payment system, they're clearly just looking for words like gender, right? So I think in the NSF, National Science Foundation, or CDC, I forgot, research, they're no longer allowed to say gender, and
they can't use the word female.
Yeah, so the problem is, though, you got to do research on females in order to understand what's happening with females.
No. That's DEI.
Yeah. Well, so this is the crazy thing. And by the way, people of different, I'm Ashkenazi Jew, right? I do actually there's a thing called, I think it's Tay-Sachs or something, that I have a proclivity to having it, so we got to have a special check. And the reason we know that is we actually do the kind of medical research to know how people of different ethnic extractions and different sexes will respond to medicine and what they may need. African Americans need certain things that Jewish Americans don't need, and this isn't some woke DEI thing, it's a biological fact. But now, because these guys are, childish, right? They're not just saying, hey, we should have a colorblind workplace. They're saying you can't say sex, the word sex, in medical research.
You can't say female. You can't say gender. I have the list here. It's absolutely patently absurd, right? Do you remember? And so that's an element of DEI, but there's another element of DEI. So when that tragic plane crash happened, within hours, Donald Trump was hustling to organize a press conference for one purpose and one purpose only, to blame the crash on DEI. Now, what did he mean in that context? It's crystal clear what he meant. He meant that if you employ women or black people or Latinos or Asian Americans, the country is maybe in jeopardy. Maybe the country's not safe if white men aren't in charge. And so sometimes DEI means the consultancy that legitimately some people think has gone a little bit overblown. Sometimes it means we just can't discuss the differences that we actually have with each other. But sometimes it just means real old-fashioned misogyny and discrimination and prejudice, right? It stands for a lot of things, most of which are pretty sick and creepy and outdated.
And, we have fair housing law. We have equal employment law. Like, you're not allowed to discriminate in housing. And so just to understand, they're not trying to just, cancel these, programs related to DEI. They're trying to cancel the civil rights movement, in statutory law, and defund anything that mentions a woman or mentions gender or mentions civil rights, right? And these are, long settled questions. And so everybody we don't need to spend all night talking about this, but we do need to, to me, when I saw that thing where it was maybe DEI was the cause of a plane crash, I thought, this is when the DEI thing jumped the shark. And as I see these pages, you can Google jumping the shark later on. Yeah,
I don't think they know jump the shark.
No, don't Google it. Google doesn't work anymore. But anyway, but this is the end of this as a useful way to understand stuff. It is now just an epithet that you hurl when you're not sure what else to say, right? And so I look back to Russ Vought for a moment. He's part of a crew, right? And it's Homan, it's Brandon Carr, who's now trying to intimidate at the FCC, who's now trying to intimidate the media. The Project 2025 crew they are really rolling. They are populating the cabinet of the president. And the president was clever enough during the campaign to disassociate himself with Project 2025. But that did not last long because about 2/3 of his senior staffers are closely affiliated with 2025. This isn't some ancillary thing. They're in it. Let me read to you something from my local Fox affiliate. Hawaii's rural health care at stake in federal funding freezes. The freezing of federal funds has thrown many nonprofit organizations in Hawaii, especially those providing healthcare services, into a state of uncertainty. Amongst these organizations, the Maui AIDS Foundation, which serves some of the most vulnerable populations on Maui. Linda Popolo, Executive Director of the Maui AIDS Foundation, is deeply concerned about the potential consequences of this freeze. Many clients fear being exposed in other healthcare settings due to stigma, which would make Maui AIDS Foundation's discreet, non-judgmental environment crucial. We have quite a lot of clients who are terrified right now because they feel like they'll be exposed anywhere else. The foundation's operating budget is about $2 million, but a significant portion of that comes from federal funding. Some grants are directly administered, while others flow through state agencies. One of the most at-risk programs is the housing subsidy for people living with HIV. And Popolo fears the worst. Without the housing grant, that's over $1 million of our housing subsidies right there. People are going to be homeless. In addition to the financial strain, Popolo expressed frustration with the lack of transparency, quote, "There's a gag order on federal employees, and we can't get any straight answers." And by the way, this has been the case. I'm sure, Chris, you've seen this in Connecticut. Like, people are actually, Russ Vought has already done it. He's not even confirmed. He's not even a government employee, but he's clearly already at the helm. And he's clearly already achieved his objective, which is to terrify and terrorize public employees. And so one of the things I've been saying, and it's like easy for me to say, I understand that. But I will tell you that the federal employees I've talked to who got that email saying fork in the road were like, now I'm not going anywhere, right? And I know 20,000 people say they signed up for it, but I was thinking about this. 20,000 people out of 2 million, first of all, I don't know if that's true. And I certainly, it's unclear to me whether that will be honored. But that's actually 1% of the workforce.
It's pretty normal attrition.
That seems like normal attrition in a 9-month period. So yeah. I think what we just did is, of the people who were planning on retiring anyway, we just gave them like a 6-month payout. So we get nothing because they get paid through September if this thing sticks. Very unclear. But if this thing sticks, they get paid through September but just retire early. And we don't achieve any sort of turnover savings. So I just think these people are trying to terrorize the workforce.
And all the federal employees who have been furloughed, from the USAID employees to all the folks who are doing DEI to the FBI agents, they're still getting paid right now, right? So for the last week, all those USAID employees were sent home. They were doing nothing to protect America, and they were still getting paychecks.
And just to be clear, they don't even have their email accounts working. So they're like, think about that. If you want to send people, first of all, it's a little weird to send people home and say, we're still operational, and then they can't even get their .aid.gov email to work, and they're not permitted to use their private email to conduct public business. And so I know someone who said, like, I'm reading spy novels. Like, I'm just killing time.
It's like almost, yeah, it's almost like the agenda isn't efficiency.
Right.
It's like almost like if you read about all the people who were going to quit anyways but quit and got a payout, and the people who are home locked out of their email but still getting paid, it's almost like there's a different agenda. And listen, you are right that the agenda is to terrorize public employees. They have made it absolutely clear to try to keep them silent and to try to make everybody decide that there's a different line of work that would be better for them. But you know what? I know the folks that work at Prudence Crandall Domestic Violence Shelter, and they didn't go into that line of work because it's lucrative, right? They didn't go into that line of work because it's an easy job, and when they get home every night at 5 o'clock, it's just really easy to unplug. That's like the hardest work in the world, to show up every day and work at a domestic violence shelter, dealing with women mostly at the worst moment in their entire life, having just fled a home in which they were regularly abused, often to the brink of death by their spouse or their boyfriend. And so, yes, they are scared today because they got told a week ago that their funds were being cut off. And that domestic violence shelter in New Britain, Connecticut, it can't run for more than a week or so without federal dollars. Guess what? Our domestic violence shelters in America do not make a profit. They do not make a profit. Newsflash, your taxpayer dollars actually do pay for domestic violence shelters. We need to actually fund that publicly because that's not something that you can make a big profit on. The women who are fleeing violence don't show up at the door with a check to pay for the shelter that they need for a couple days. Those people are scared. They are feeling harassed. They don't know whether the doors will remain open, but they are not going home. They are not going home because they have decided to live their life in a way devoted to a mission, And so this is a moment to just say thank you, frankly, to all of the folks who work either for not-for-profits that rely on government funding, who are public employees doing the good work, who are staying on the job. I don't begrudge anybody who decides that, listen, I'm better off if I just go and do something else amidst this harassment campaign. But I'm thankful on behalf of abused women in Connecticut that there are people who are deciding to stay on the job despite the fact that they are getting threatened and harassed by the Trump administration and, in particular, the nominee that we're discussing today.
Well, I think, I've been, on one level, trying not to overreact, but I also think there's a little danger of underreacting. And I've been talking about this a little bit with my brother, who's a professor with an expertise in former Soviet Union countries, Kazakhstan in particular. And so, in this town, and you know this, Chris, in this town, the worst thing is to be overreacting. Like, that's just very not cool for the cocktail party and pundit circuit. Everything is always going to be fine. And if you are alarmed, you're shrill, that means you're not savvy. And the savvy thing is always that this will land fine. And I feel like we're sleepwalking into a very dangerous place. And so as I think of my theory of change, just mine, I don't presume to know exactly what we should do, all of us. I know in the legislative context we've got to do a couple of things. We've got to find opportunities. We only have 47 of us, so we have to find opportunities to find 3 or 4 Republicans. And I had some very constructive conversations with Republican appropriators who are super uncomfortable with what's going on. Now, they might not be quite ready to go public, but they are certainly trying to figure out how they're going to exert their authorities and reestablish that, it's co-equal branches here. So part of our strategy has to include find Republican support where we can. I think part of our strategy has to be where we can't to not make it easy for our Republican colleagues as they try to march to the beat of Donald Trump's drum. I think we also have an obligation to just speak out and explain to the public, especially when we're powerless to stop things, what exactly is happening and why it's bad. But the rest of society has a role here, too. I think the media has an obligation to stop underreacting, stop treating like super unconstitutional, illegal, thuggy acts as if it's just like the president proposed there be a AI commission or something. Like, the way these things are talked about, it's like, president attempts to reform USAID. It's like, no, that's not what happened. They stormed in and they took over the servers. They stand over people and tell them what to do, and if those people don't do exactly what the Doge folks say, they are relieved of their duty on the spot. And then they sent everybody home, and then they got into the secure conference facility, the SCIF. Like, this is not to be characterized as something kind of mundane and, this week there's a markup on the social media bill. Like, this is different, and we've got to treat it differently. And there also is a role for the federal employee, and to your point, where they can, because I don't presume to know anybody's personal situation, and a lot of people, got other personal stuff going on, and I can't ask for them to be brave on my behalf. But there are some people who are deeply committed and deeply patriotic and care about the mission and care about public service, and all I would ask you is stay if you can. Stay if you can. And if someone tries to shove you around, and if someone tries to tell you to do something that feels like it might not be permissible, don't do it. Talk to your union. Ask them whether this is authorized by law. Stick, because they are counting on you sort of vanishing from the scene. And then the other thing, and Chris, you and I have talked about this, you're the one that pointed it out to me. The difference between this week and last week is that individual citizens are physically showing up to protest what's happening. All across the country. I mean, we've been here in Washington, D.C., and we've seen it at the Treasury Building and at the Senate, they call it the Senate Swamp and elsewhere. But it's been a minute since people have showed up in person this organically. And I think that's a really important aspect of any mass movement to preserve democracy. It can't just be your legislators fighting in the legislative context. We only get credibility if there are people behind us. And now, I think we were in a bit of a slumber, frankly. And I think the American public was in a bit of a slumber. There was this sense of, some people were excited about the election, some people were sad about the election, but everybody was kind of not animated in the same way that they were prior to the first Trump term. And over the last week, people said, oh my goodness, this is real. And by the way, even Republicans who were sort of imagining that this was all going to be manageable and you're going to just get your conservative outcomes with some mean tweets. That's what people thought they were going to get. I really believe that. Good people that I know thought, this guy's going to be good for the economy, he's going to be provocative online, and that'll be that.
Well, and listen, and you had Trump's first term as evidence, right? Obviously, President Trump says a lot of things that he has no intent in doing. Like, newsflash, we aren't going to invade and occupy Gaza. But he says a lot of things that he does.
No on that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say 99% of Americans are no on that. And in his first term, he said a lot of things that he never even tried to do. He said a lot of reckless things that he never actually followed up on. And during the campaign, he said many things that sounded a little crazy to folks. He said, I'm going to be a dictator on day one. He said that, the number one enemy of the people are Democrats, and I'm going to use the military to take care of the enemy of the within, which he referenced as his political opposition. And I think many Americans said, you know what, I heard him say a lot of stuff like that in his first term. He's not going to really do it. And so you're right. After the election, we had an election. He won. And people assumed that things were going to be different. Things were going to be a little bit more topsy-turvy. Maybe this country needed to be shaken up a little bit. But they actually didn't believe he was going to act like a dictator. They actually didn't believe he was going to violate the Constitution so brazenly in the first month. They didn't believe that he was going to shut down funding for preschools and for medical research.
Everyone in the January 6th event, and you know this, and you've talked about this on the floor, they recommended that he pardon essentially the people who improperly entered the building. Now, I would have opposed that. But then he just said, you know what? Pardon them all.
Because it was too hard, as he explained, to try to pick out the really violent ones from the nonviolent ones. Later tonight, I'm going to read through some of the very easily accessible stories of the really violent protesters. It wasn't that hard to just pick out a handful of people who literally beat police officers over the head with poles that stuck tasers into the necks of police officers until they had a heart attack. It wasn't hard to identify those people and say, you know what, those people should stay in jail, those people should complete their term. The American public didn't think that he was really going to absolve everyone who invaded the Capitol and beat the hell out of police officers that day. And so the reason that it has taken a minute for the people to rise up, and by the way, we've seen big crowds in D.C., but that doesn't really mean much if there's nobody out there in the American public. Today there were pretty big rallies in all 50 states. This weekend there are going to be many more. It's because people, even many who voted for him, but many who didn't and, just wanted to respect the choice of the electorate, are now realizing that this is so much more dystopian than the first term was, and a crisis that is going to immediately impact them in a real way. It's not somebody else's problem. It now seems to be my problem when a billionaire has access to my Social Security, Medicare, and tax refund data. That sounds like something that actually potentially hurts me.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that we are. And every day I try to sort out of the 20 outrages, how many can I even focus on? And to your point, the Gaza thing was deeply offensive, right? Deeply offensive. But also, probably not worth devoting a ton of bandwidth to, because by some accounts, people I think who do know, it's pretty clear to me he does not have a plan. He's just literally talking. And so sometimes we're going to have to not quite pull a punch, but not hair on fire freak out, because that's not, to your point, that's not happening, right? That's not happening. They would need an appropriation. They'd probably need a war authorization. And by the way, occupying a country in the Middle East it doesn't usually work.
Often doesn't go well.
Yeah.
But here's the difference, though, getting back to the nominee, right? Russ Vought is a serious person with the ability to execute on plans.
Yep.
Right? And so his plan, which is to destroy elements of the federal government and state governments and the nonprofit sector that help regular people, his plan to try to intimidate and harass federal workers, his plan to try to make folks who work in government pass a loyalty test to the administration, his plan to destroy access to reproductive health care. I mean, all of that is being put into place as we speak. So, what makes this moment so dangerous is that they kind of learned their lessons. They wanted to do a lot of these things in the first term, but it all kind of snuck up on them really fast. They had 4 years to put into place a plan called Project 2025 so that they could, starting on day one, destroy services for the middle class and poor people, root out of government anybody that doesn't swear a loyalty test, and endorse violence in a way that hopefully suppresses political dissent. That's not working right now, and I don't think it will work. But Russ Vought is dangerous because he's got radical ideas, and he actually has the means to implement them very quickly.
Dude. Yeah, he's a smart dude, and he's a serious guy, and he actually knows the government. I mean, part of the problem with the Doge folks, they don't really know what they're even looking for, so they literally just like Control F. Oh, does it say gender? Maybe this is bad. Maybe this is woke. Like, that's terrible and irresponsible, but it's also incompetent. But Russ Vought is not incompetent. Like, he has an actual project. Not just Project 2025, but he's been like this for a while. He has a view of the government, which is that the bigger the government is, the less freedom you have. And like Ben Sass, our old friend and colleague who's now retired from the Senate, like he had that sincere view, right? And it was a kind of radical view, but it was sincerely held that, I would go to him and go, what about rural health clinics? And like he was consistent, nope, right? What about federal firefighters? Counties can take care of that, right? I don't want to characterize all of Ben's views, but what about the Federal Emergency Management Agency? Nope, got to get rid of that. And like FEMA's a really good example of, there are just some things that if you're going to have a country, that your federal government has to do. Because I think of two examples. When the town of Lahaina burned down, the county of Maui is kind of small. It's a couple 100,000 people. It's not a poor county. It has some tax base and all the rest of it. But it's not capable to respond to a disaster where a whole town burned down, was incinerated to the ground in like 3 hours. 2,200 structures. 2,200 structures, basically between 6 and midnight. All of them gone. 109 lives lost. And so the federal government comes in when this is how a disaster declaration works. The county or the state submits something to the President of the United States and basically says, we can't handle this. This disaster is bigger than our ability to handle it, right? And then the President signs the disaster declaration, and then that releases FEMA to go and be on the scene. And if there's no FEMA, there's no recovery. Like FEMA prevented I got in some fights with FEMA about the way they were doing it, but they're good humans, trying their very best to alleviate suffering. And in the immediate wake of those wildfires, nobody went hungry, nobody lacked a place to live, and it's going to be a long recovery, but people's most basic needs were met. And when I think about Western North Carolina in particular, on some level it's worse. It was bigger, it was more structures, it was actually more property damage, and it was so vast. I mean, just the portion that got flooded is like the size of some small states. And these little towns are not even as big as Maui County, right? These are 500 people, 700 people, 2,000 people, 75 people. Like, if the federal government doesn't come in and help folks like that through FEMA, then you're just leaving people, really to fend for themselves. And over the last year, these disasters keep getting worse and worse. Like, I suppose we can pretend it's not climate change. Even if you want to pretend it's not climate change, you have to concede that something is out there that is causing us to have more frequent and more severe disasters. Okay? So let's set aside the question of climate and what we ought to do about it. Everybody knows my view and everybody knows your view. But the fact is we had about $150 billion worth of damage last year. And so I am not prepared to tell small states, small counties, little towns that they are on their own. But that's what Project 2025 wants to do.
So one of the things that's confusing for everybody, including us about this moment, is that it's not clear whether there is consistency or inconsistency. So you may be right that they are going to try to just destroy FEMA writ large and just erase from existence the ability for our country to come together in a patriotic way to try to help out our neighbors when a natural disaster hits. But it can't be coincidental that they launched the idea to destroy FEMA in California when a very blue state was responding to a terrible disaster, right? That doesn't seem coincidental. It doesn't also seem coincidental that the first big infrastructure project that the president came out and said that he would be defunding was also in California. Well, an equally big city-to-city high-speed infrastructure project in Florida is on no one's radar screen. And so this may be a consistent nationwide assault on public services, but it also may be, or in addition may be, simply a grift in order to provide services and grants in states that are loyal to the president, meaning they voted for him, and to deny services to states that are not loyal. We have not historically cared at all whether a natural disaster hit a state that sends Democrats or Republicans to the United States Senate. We have, sometimes had fights over how much money and when we're going to authorize disaster assistance, but we have never fought over whether a blue state or a red state should get it if the other party is in charge of the United States Senate. But all of a sudden, that seems very relevant. That seems very relevant. And part of the reason why the Constitution does not allow the president to have power over spending decisions is because that leads to a fundamental potential for corruption.
Yeah, so before you came on, Senator Kim talked about taking on the New Jersey political machine. Mm-hmm. And just, political machines everywhere work pretty much the same. If you behave well, you get your stuff, right? And pork is distributed based on political alliances. And so I think you're right to notice that the President of the United States wants to sort of create a Tammany Hall vibe nationwide. I will say, just to take your own advice, that on, say, withholding disaster aid from California, that feels like he's just ranting. And he's not actually in a position to do that because the Stafford Act provides that this is a disaster and that once we fund it, they have to help, and they will help. They're not permitted not to help. Now, he may stretch the boundaries of the law, but I do not think he is in a position to withhold aid. Now, do I think Mike Johnson is going to initiate a disaster supplemental for California? No. But the terrible fact of the matter is there will be disasters going forward, and they hit blue states and red states equally. You can just never know.
But what Trump says, whether or not he ends up implementing it, sets the agenda for his party. And so what is the speaker talking about, and what are many of our colleagues talking about with respect to aid to California? Yes, they are very worried about setting a precedent in which a state doesn't get aid if they are of the opposite party of the party in charge. But they know that they have to be loyal to the basic premise of the president, and so they're talking about conditions, right? That California is going to have to change its laws to, I would assume, more align itself with Republican priorities in order for it to get money, which would be a perversion of federal law and precedent, and very dangerous.
It's not changing laws regarding disaster preparedness or infrastructure. It's changing laws on voter ID.
Right.
Like, it's just pure, and that is one of the things I've noticed about this president is, just the unapologetic, I've got leverage and I'm going to use it aspect of it, and nobody bats an eyelash. If you behaved like that, you'd get lit on fire appropriately. And so I think, one of the things that I have noticed over the last couple of weeks is there's people, look, Democrats need to understand this guy is unusually talented. And we used to think, oh, what a buffoon and whatever. Maybe, but he's a very talented politician in a very unconventional way. But he is also not infallible. He is capable of making incompetent decisions. He's capable of being beaten legislatively in the court of public opinion. Right now, he's in the saddle because he has all these EOs, all these executive orders. But eventually, events overtake. And a president usually is responding to events rather than creating conditions on the ground. And so part of the thing that I want everybody to kind of understand as they feel their frustration, as they kind of process and try to metabolize the flurry of nonsense coming at the American people, is just to understand it's not always going to be like this. They don't have 1,200 days worth of executive orders ready to go. And that as these things some of them are just like wishes and could have been a tweet. Many of them are illegal. And then in some cases, the president does have pretty raw authority. Tariffs, he can do, right? And there's not much the legislature can do about it. But a lot of these things are, my favorite EO was I think it was a presidential memo, not an EO, but after the plane crash last week, they did a memo that was like, this was Joe Biden's fault. Right. And I was like, okay, now we're cooking. He's like, I want another EO to just say it was Biden's fault. And so that's kind of like when they admitted that what they're doing is when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They understand that their agenda is so unpopular. Their agenda is so unpopular that they can't even get it through the Congress of their own party, right?
As happened in 2017.
They couldn't even do the things that they promised they were going to do, except for the tax cuts. And so I think they understand the fundamental weakness of their position, which is we've got a president who's likely to do very unpopular things. And although he's not unpopular at the moment, he is, relatively speaking, very unpopular for a newly inaugurated president, historically unpopular for a newly inaugurated president. And this is only going to get worse because everybody knows the way he conducts himself does not age well. And so they're in a hurry. But it's not always going to feel like this. It's not always going to be like this. They will lose in court. They will lose in the court of public opinion. I'm not suggesting we're not about to experience some bad public policy outcomes and that people will not suffer. A lot of bad stuff is about to happen. But the roots of democracy are deep. And like my friend Calvin said, bend but don't break. So I just want everybody to understand, bend but don't break. I'm so proud of Chris for coming here and staying from 2 to 5. I may go get a little more coffee and come and join you, or I may take a nap. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.